Champlain probably did 23 or 24 maps over the period of 30 years in Canada. And this is one of his maps of the greater Montreal area, which of course he figured was the outlet to China. Champlain was really interested in finding the route to China. Champlain publishes Les Voyages, and very, very important book, again another travel log. One of the most interesting things, Champlain not only publishes 4 books in his life and maybe 23 or 24 maps, but he does an awful lot of other things as well. But we have the ability to really understand what Champlain and the French were trying to do because of his writings. In 1609, now that the establishment of Quebec is secure, Champlain goes down the Richelieu and or the Iroquois River, now called the Richelieu River, and discovers Lake Champlain, which of course he calls after himself. In 1613, he goes up the Ottawa. This is the first time that not the first time that a European has gone up the Ottawa. Etienne Brulé did that in 1610, but Champlain was really interested in trying again to conduct Western exploration. And he gets all the way to Allumette Island, where one of his truchements, Nicolas Vigneault, develops a real problem with the natives that he's staying with. What Nicolas Vigneault says is that there have been 8 Europeans found on a saltwater sea much to the north of the Ottawa River. And of course, anyone knows the history. Henry Hudson was working up in the what is now Hudson Bay and James Bay, and of course there was a mutiny and 8 people were cut adrift. And Champlain thinks that this might be the route to the northern sea. Then in 1615, he makes the big trip up the Ottawa, across the Mattawa, Lake Nipissing, down the French, and then down into Wendake or Huronia. He then goes down to participate in a battle against the Onondaga, where he's wounded in the knee to the point where he cannot walk, and he is carried back to Huronia. Well, Champlain really wanted, upon completion of his attack, which he considered to be a complete failure, and all his allies considered to be a major victory, he wanted to go back down this way. But the Wendat would not let him go, number 1, because he was wounded, and number 2, because they were too concerned that the Mohawk could intercept him. And if he were killed, that would destroy all of the work that not only Champlain, but all these native groups had developed in the various treaties that they were working on. So he was physically brought back to Wendake. While there, he then went over to visit the Piton, another nation of two nations, another confederacy of Iroquoian-speaking peoples that lived in the greater Collingwood area. So the Wendat are 4 nations living in Wendake or Huronia, and he also visits the Ottawa and the Piton, and so that's why there's this little trail. And then in May of 1616, he retraces the route and returns to Quebec City. Champlain also finds a group of religious called the Recollets in Paris, and the Recollets are the first religious order to actually serve in the interior. The Jesuits were working in Acadia, but the Jesuits were not asked to participate in the Canadian, what I call the upper Canadian missions, until 1625, when Montmorency and the Duc de Ventadour decides that he wants the Jesuits. So the Recollets and Father Joseph Le Caron actually come up with Champlain to Huronia in 1615, and says the first Mass, I believe on August 2nd in north of Midland. So this is the Recollet. Champlain had organized the fact that religious salvation would be something that the native inhabitants would want. They asked for priests, and that was the result. This is the attack of the Iroquois or Haudenoshonne village in 1615, and Champlain makes the little sort of fortress to be able to shoot into the village. The Wendat attack with fire, but ultimately the village withstands the attack. Champlain considers it to be a major defeat, but the Wendat were able to capture a few Iroquois, and the whole idea of warfare as annihilation versus showing strength is a completely different philosophical take that natives had versus the Europeans. And this is a great shot in that lithograph of an armed soldier, and these are probably matchlocks. The flintlock is only developed in 1610 and takes a little while to get into general distribution. So here you have somebody that's going by canoe over 1,000 kilometers, and he's got all his armor, he's got his guns, he's got his sword, he's got his helmet. So these guys must have really looked unusual to the First Nations groups that encountered these soldiers. Okay, Champlain the administrator. Champlain is wounded in this battle with the Onondaga in 1615, and we think that had a role to play on Champlain assuming greater administrative responsibilities. And what he tries to do as an administrator is develop the colony. He tries to create, he makes a real effort to try to make peace with the Iroquois through the 1620s. He is unsuccessful, more or less unsuccessful. At least there's no warfare, but I don't think the Iroquois considered him to be a great individual. Champlain also brings his wife in 1620 over to live in Canada, and she lasts 5 years, goes back to France. Champlain, we think, probably had the nicest time of his life with his wife here in Canada. She got very interested in native girls and educating them. Also, Louis XIII really becomes king. Champlain is his lieutenant general, so he's reporting directly to Louis. And Cardinal Richelieu in 1626 decides that all of these different monopolies are a pain. They lack the funding, so he develops what's called the Company of 100 Associates, and in 1627, Champlain becomes his lieutenant general. So it's very important to realize that Champlain was the king's representative in Canada for both Henry IV and Louis XIII. So he really is the king's man. And Champlain is one of the investors of the 100 Associates. Now in 1629, because as a result of this Company of 100 Associates, this gentleman, Jervis Kirk, and his 5 sons, David Kirk, eventually they basically put an embargo on the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they capture all the 100 Associate ships coming over to victual and bring more inhabitants to the region. And in 1629, finally in July, Champlain capitulates and hands over the rights of the French to David Kirk at Quebec in July of 1629. And this is a version of what it might have looked like. Champlain is returned to England. He goes over to the French ambassador and demands that the French ambassador insist on the British that they relinquish Quebec. In 1630, Champlain returns to Brouage, where he has 3 homes, and we're not sure if this is one of his 3 homes, but this is an older styled home in Brouage, and he sells all of his assets in Brouage One of the homes he sells to his best friend, who has also been a cartographer since youth in Brouage. So very important, this gives him a reasonable amount of cash. With the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye on March the 29th, 1632, Quebec is returned to the French. Champlain also publishes the most important map of the very early period of Canada. And of course it shows Lake Ontario, Lac des Hurons, and Lac Supérieur because it's so big. What he doesn't have, of course, is any knowledge per se of Lake Erie and Lake Michigan, but that will come very, very quickly. So he certainly has the cartographic representation of most of the Atlantic, and from Henry Hudson, Hudson's Bay, and the shape of North America is slowly coming together as a result of his efforts. He suffers a stroke in 1635 in the summer, and on the 25th of December, Champlain suffers another stroke and dies at Quebec City, and he's buried in the church of Notre-Dame de la Couvrance. And so far, an archaeologist by the name of René Lévesque has not found where Champlain's burial actually has been put. The king announces that the next individual will actually be a governor. And so Governor Charles Montmagny in 1636 comes out to New France, and he is designated officially as governor. Champlain was never officially given the title of governor, but in fact for more than 20 years he was a lieutenant. He was a number of different descriptors to fulfill that role. So Champlain's dream and legacy. Sam, like seems to have developed very white hair as a result of many of the bronzes that have been created to honor him. And what's really great about Champlain, all men are not suited to take the risk. The trouble and fatigue are great, but nothing is to be had without toil. That is one what must think in these affairs. It will be when it pleases God. As for me, I will always prepare the way for those who will wish after me to carry it on. So that basically is Champlain's story.